The year is 480 BC. Persian king Xerxes sits on a throne placed on a hillside and looks down at the sea. In front of him are hundreds of ships: Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cilicians, Ionian Greeks, forced to fight for Persia. Warships from every corner of a vast empire have gathered here. This empire stretches from Asia Minor to Egypt, from Babylon to the borders of India. On the water stands a fleet that seems impossible to challenge. Against it are only a few hundred Greek triremes. These are narrow wooden ships with bronze rams on their bows. Their crews are exhausted. Their cities are burning. Athens has already been taken. The Acropolis has been looted. Temples have been destroyed. Women, children, and the elderly have been evacuated to the islands. Greece is standing on the edge of disappearance. But it is here, in the narrow strait near the island of Salamis, that the fate of Europe will be decided. In the open sea, the Persian fleet could crush the Greeks with numbers. But Themistocles will force Xerxes to enter a place where numbers become a trap. He will force him into a strait where hundreds of ships will begin to block each other. Oars will break against oars. The enormous fleet of the empire will turn into a helpless crowd. And the small Greek triremes will strike the sides of enemy ships, turn away, and attack again. By morning, the sea near Salamis will be covered with wreckage, bodies, shields, oars, and blood. The Persian king, who came to conquer Greece, will watch from above as his fleet dies before his eyes. But to understand why everything was decided here, we need to rewind time. 10 years before Salamis, the Persians had already come to Greece. Back then, they were stopped at Marathon. The Athenians, almost without help from their allies, defeated the army of Darius. For the huge Persian Empire, this was not just a defeat. It was a humiliation. A small city-state on the edge of the world had dared to defeat the King of Kings. Darius wanted to return and punish the Greeks, but he did not live long enough to do it. After his death, power passed to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes was not just an heir. He was the ruler of a colossal empire. In his hands were the riches of Babylon, Egypt, Phoenicia, and Asia Minor. His army was gathered from dozens of peoples. His fleet was built by the best sailors of the Eastern Mediterranean. He wanted to finish what his father had started. Greece had to fall. Not one city, not one region, all of Greece. The preparation took years. In the north, near Mount Athos, the Persians dug a canal so their fleet would not be destroyed by dangerous waters. Across the Hellespont, they built bridges made of ships so the army could cross from Asia into Europe. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes, according to ancient authors, flew into a rage. He ordered the sea itself to be punished. The waters of the Hellespont were whipped. This sounds like a legend, but it shows very clearly how the Greeks saw Xerxes. They saw him as a man who believed that even nature had to obey his will. And then the enormous Persian army moved south. The Greeks were divided. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Aegina, and Megara each had their own interests, pride, and old conflicts. For decades, they could fight each other over land, trade, and power. But now they faced a force that no city could survive alone. On land, the Persians were blocked at Thermopylae. It was a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea. A few thousand Greeks stood there against a massive army. For 3 days they held the pass. Then a traitor showed the Persians a mountain path. The Greek force was surrounded. King Leonidas and his warriors died. Thermopylae became a symbol of courage. But strategically, the road into central Greece was now open. At almost the same time, the Greeks were fighting at sea near Artemisium. There, they first felt the power of the Persian fleet. The battle did not bring a decisive victory, but after the fall of Thermopylae, the Greek fleet had to retreat. Now the next target of the Persians was Athens. And here one man came to the front. Without him, Salamis might never have happened. His name was Themistocles. He was an Athenian politician. He was harsh, clever, and ambitious. Many people disliked him, but nobody could ignore him. Several years before the invasion, rich silver deposits were found in the mines of Laurion. The citizens wanted to divide the profit among themselves. Themistocles convinced them to do something else. He convinced them to build a fleet, not a dozen ships, not a symbolic squadron, hundreds of triremes. At the time, many people thought this was a strange idea. Athens was a land city. Its strength was in citizen hoplites, heavy infantrymen with shields and spears. But Themistocles understood something others did not. The future of Athens was at sea. When the Persians came, these ships became the only chance. In Delphi, the Athenians asked the oracle how to save the city. The answer was dark. Athens would be destroyed. But inside the prophecy were words about wooden walls. Some believed this meant they had to fortify the Acropolis with wooden barriers. Themistocles said no. The wooden walls were the ships. Stones would not save Athens. Temples would not save Athens. The fleet would save Athens. He convinced the Athenians to do the unthinkable. He convinced them to abandon the city. Women, children, and the elderly were taken to Salamis, Aegina, and Treason. The men boarded the ships. The city was left almost empty. When the Persians entered Athens, they did not find a capital ready to surrender. They found a ghost. A few remaining defenders tried to hold the Acropolis. They were killed. The temples were burned. The sacred places were looted. Athens had fallen. For the Greeks, this was a blow that is difficult to imagine. Their city, the center of their world, was in flames. But Athens as a political force still existed. It existed as long as its fleet existed. The Greek ships gathered near the island of Salamis. Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, Aeginetans, Megarians, and other allies were there. Formally, the commander was the Spartan Eurybiades. But the real mind behind the strategy was Themistocles. And immediately the allies began to argue. Many Peloponnesians wanted to retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth. They wanted to move closer to Sparta and Corinth. There, on land, they were already building a defensive wall. Their logic was simple. They wanted to defend the Peloponnese, not the ruined city of Athens. Themistocles understood that if the fleet left Salamis, everything would be over. In the open sea, the Persians would use their numbers. The Greek ships would be surrounded. The alliance would fall apart. Every city-state would start saving itself. And if the Persian fleet gained control of the sea, it could land troops anywhere. Could land behind any defensive line. Could land behind any wall. Could land behind any isthmus. Greece could not be saved without the sea. Themistocles demanded one thing. They had to fight here. They had to fight in the narrow strait. Here, the Persian fleet would not be able to deploy properly. Here, the quality of the crews, knowledge of the waters, and the heavy Greek ships would matter more than numbers. But the allies hesitated. At night, talks of retreat began. Ships were preparing to leave Salamis. And then Themistocles took a risk. This risk could have made him either the savior of Greece or a traitor. He sent a secret messenger to Xerxes. The message was simple. The Greeks were frightened and were preparing to flee. If the Persians attacked now and blocked the exits from the strait, the entire Greek fleet would be trapped. It was a lie. And at the same time, it was a trap. Themistocles made Xerxes believe he had a chance to destroy the Greeks with one strike. Xerxes believed him. He ordered his fleet to move at night and block the straits. Now the Greeks could no longer retreat, even if they wanted to. Themistocles had achieved his goal. The battle had become inevitable. The Persian ships entered the waters near Salamis. Imagine that night. A dark sea, hundreds of ships, the creaking of oars, the voices of commanders speaking different languages. Phoenician sailors, Egyptian troops, Cypriots, Cilicians, Ionians. A huge multinational machine of empire was slowly pulling itself into a narrow space. On the shore, Xerxes ordered a throne to be placed for him. He wanted to see the victory with his own eyes. Scribes stood nearby. They were supposed to write down the names of those who distinguished themselves in battle. Xerxes was certain that by morning the Greek fleet would be destroyed. Among his commanders was one woman whose name would enter history. Her name was Artemisia. She was the queen of Caria. She was an experienced naval commander. She was an ally of Persia. Before the battle, she advised Xerxes not to enter the narrow strait. She told him not to fight where the Greeks had chosen the battlefield. She advised him to wait. She advised him to blockade them. She advised him to let the Greek allies quarrel among themselves. It was a reasonable suggestion, but Xerxes chose to attack. He wanted a beautiful victory. He wanted to see Greece break before his eyes. At dawn, the Greeks began to move their ships out. A trireme was not just a boat. It was a war machine. Around 170 rowers sat inside it. It had 3 levels of oars. It had a narrow hull. On its bow was a bronze ram. This ram was not made for boarding. It was made to strike the side of an enemy ship. The main weapon of a trireme was speed and precision. Accelerate, strike, break through the enemy hull below the waterline, pull away, turn, strike again. But this required discipline. The rowers had to work like one body. One wrong movement and the ship lost speed. One collision with an ally and the entire formation could collapse. In the open sea, the Persian fleet could surround the Greeks, could attack their flanks, could use its mobility. But in the Strait of Salamis, the space became tighter and tighter. On one side was the island. On the other side was the coast of Attica. Ahead was the Greek formation. Behind were their own ships. The more Persian ships entered the strait, the worse it became for the Persians themselves. The first line slowed down. The rear ships pushed forward. Oars caught on oars. Commands could no longer be heard. Different languages, different squadrons, different commanders. The empire, which was powerful on land, began to turn into chaos at sea. And then a Greek battle hymn rang out over the strait. The Greeks were not running. They were moving forward. For the Persians, this was the first shock. They had been promised that the enemy was frightened. They had been told that the Greeks were preparing to escape. They had expected to finish off fleeing ships in the morning. But instead, rows of Greek triremes moved toward them out of the morning light. Athenians, Aeginetans, Spartan and Corinthian ships. On the decks stood warriors in helmets and armor. At the oars were citizens who knew what stood behind them. Behind them were not just soldiers. Behind them were families. Behind them were refugees. Behind them were burned Athens and the last hope of Greece. The first strike came in the narrow part of the strait. Greek triremes began to ram Persian ships. They did not attack randomly. They did not simply crash into the crowd. They chose the side of the enemy ship. Acceleration, impact, wood cracked. The bronze ram entered the hull. Water rushed inside. The ship tilted. Men fell from the deck. Rowers trapped in the lower levels could not escape in time. Some drowned inside the ship itself. Persian vessels tried to maneuver, but there was no space. One ship moved backward and crashed into its own side. Another tried to turn and broke the oars of a neighboring ship. A third lost control and became a target. Panic did not spread at once. At first, there were only separate collisions. Then the lines became confused. Then came the cries of commanders whom nobody could hear anymore. Then came a traffic jam on the sea. The Greeks knew these waters. They understood the currents. They understood the distances. They understood the depths. They understood the turns of the strait. For them, Salamis was not a trap. For them, it was an arena prepared in advance. The Persians, on the other hand, had entered foreign waters. And the more ships Xerxes threw into the battle, the more they interfered with each other. The Phoenicians, the best sailors of the Persian fleet, fought fiercely. The Egyptians held their ground. The Ionians, Greeks by blood but subjects of Persia, found themselves in a tragic position. They were fighting other Greeks while knowing that the outcome would decide their own fate too. Xerxes watched from the shore. At first, he probably still believed that the confusion was temporary. He believed that the enormous fleet would soon close in and crush the small Greek formation. But the hours passed. The picture became more and more terrifying. The Persian ships could not use their numbers. Their lines were mixed. Ships were sinking. Men in the water grabbed pieces of wreckage. Greek triremes again and again moved out of formation, struck and returned. At some point, the battle turned into a series of separate deadly fights. Ship against ship, ram against hull, boarding wherever the ships became locked together. On the decks, men fought with spears, swords, and axes. Rowers dropped their oars and tried to save themselves. Marines pushed enemies into the water. Shields slid across wet wooden decks. Blood mixed with sea foam. And here, one of the strangest episodes of the battle took place. Artemisia, Queen of Caria, was being chased by a Greek ship. In front of her, an allied Persian ship blocked her path. She had almost no choice. She rammed it, her own ally. The ship sank. The Greeks saw this and thought Artemisia had changed sides. Or they thought she was an ally. They stopped chasing her. Xerxes saw from the shore that her ship had sunk another vessel. But he did not understand that it was a Persian ship. He was told that Artemisia had destroyed an enemy. According to legend, Xerxes then said that his men had become women, and his women had become men. Even in disaster, he noticed her courage. But the courage of individual commanders could no longer save the fleet. The Persian formation was collapsing. Every minute, more ships tried to leave the strait, but the exit was blocked too. The ships in the rear did not understand what was happening at the front. The ships in front wanted to retreat. The middle was squeezed between them. The Greeks struck those who tried to turn around. The Aeginetans, positioned near the exit, intercepted the fleeing ships. What was supposed to be the encirclement of the Greeks became the encirclement of the Persians. Xerxes was no longer seeing a distant defeat. He was seeing it directly in front of him. He saw the ships of the peoples who called him king sinking. He saw small cities which he had come to erase from the map, breaking the fleet of the greatest empire in the world. By evening, it was over. The sea near Salamis was covered with wreckage. The Persian fleet had lost dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of ships. Greek losses were much smaller. But the numbers were not the most important thing. The most important thing was that the myth of Xerxes' invincibility had collapsed. The Persian army was still in Greece. Athens was still ruined. The Greek cities were still in danger. But after Salamis, Persia had lost the most important thing. It had lost control of the sea. Without the fleet, it was difficult to supply the enormous army in Greece. Troops could no longer be moved safely. Defensive lines could no longer be bypassed so easily. The entire Greek world could no longer be held in a ring. Xerxes faced a choice. He could stay and risk the whole campaign, or he could retreat and preserve the royal army. He chose retreat. He left part of the army in Greece under the command of Mardonius. But Xerxes himself returned to Asia. For the Greeks, this was almost unbelievable. Not long before, it had seemed that everything was lost. Thermopylae had fallen. Athens had been burned. The allies had argued and were preparing to scatter. And suddenly there was victory. It was not complete. It was not final. But it was enough to prove that Persia could be stopped. The next year, the Greeks would defeat the land army of Mardonius at Plataea. Around the same time, the Persian fleet would suffer another blow at Mycale. The Second Persian War would end in defeat for the empire. But the turning point happened at Salamis. Salamis was not just a naval battle. It was the victory of strategy over numbers. It was the victory of geography over scale. It was the victory of cunning over arrogance. Themistocles understood what Xerxes did not. Sometimes the battlefield matters more than the army. In the open sea, the Persians were stronger. In the narrow strait, the Greeks became stronger. Xerxes came with the fleet of an empire. Themistocles forced him to use that fleet in the wrong way. And by doing this, he saved Greece. After Salamis, Athens would rebuild the city. Its fleet would become the foundation of a new power. The Athenian Maritime Alliance would appear. Athens would become the center of the Greek world. The age of Pericles would begin. The Parthenon, theater, philosophy, Socrates, Sophocles, Herodotus, Thucydides. What we now call classical Greece might never have happened if the Greek ships had broken that morning at Salamis. But they did not break. Salamis became one of those battles where the result was decided not only by swords, rams and oars. It was decided by fear. It was decided by argument. It was decided by deception. It was decided by the right choice of place. and it was decided by the will of people who had nowhere left to retreat. Today, if you stand on the shores of Salamis and look at the narrow strait, it is hard to imagine that the fate of an entire civilization was decided here. The sea is calm, the shores look ordinary, but 2,500 years ago, drums thundered here, oars broke here, ships sank here, and the king of the greatest empire of his time watched as his victory turned into catastrophe. It was here that a small Greek fleet proved that even a giant can be vulnerable in a narrow strait. If you enjoyed this video, support it with a like and subscribe.